Hi, I'm Lisette Jacobson, host of the Black, Brown, and Bilingue podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Coming up on this episode of the House of EdTech podcast, it's time to figure out what you're going to podcast about. Strike up the band. Welcome to the House of EdTech. My name is Chris Nessie. The House of EdTech launched in 2014, giving me the opportunity to speak with teachers, leaders, and creators so you can more effectively integrate technology, strengthen your pedagogy, and have more confidence in your classroom and school so you can make an impact. Get involved with the podcast by visiting my website, chrisnessie.com. Using technology isn't difficult, and this is where it begins. This is the House of EdTech. Welcome back to another episode of the House of EdTech podcast. If you are a new listener, welcome. If you are a returning listener, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed episode 248 as I am giving away my book, I Like to Podcast, and you will too, A House of EdTech Guide to Podcasting. I self-published the book back in August of 2023, and in this episode, in addition to going through the next chapter, Chapter 2, I will also provide along the way some additional commentary on the topic of podcasting. If you would like to pick up a copy of the book for yourself or someone else, go to chrisnessie.com/I Like to Podcast. The book is available physically, and you can also pick it up for your Kindle. If you don't want to pick up a copy of the book, but you are getting value from this and you're enjoying the chapters and the content, feel free to show your appreciation by visiting chrisnessie.com/support. I'd also like to invite you to join my Discord community, where we can discuss the book, technology, and of course, education. To do that, go to chrisnessie.com/discord. There will be links for everything that I talk about in the show notes for this episode, which are a swipe or a tap away in the app you are listening in, or go to chrisnessie.com/249. And now, I'd like to present Chapter 2, Choosing a Topic and Format for Your Podcast. This chapter covers the important step of starting a podcast, choosing a topic and format. This chapter begins by discussing the importance of identifying your target audience and selecting a niche topic that will appeal to them. The chapter also covers different podcast formats, including solo, interview, and more. It also offers some tips for choosing the best format for your podcast. The chapter also includes advice on developing a unique angle or hook for your podcast that will help it stand out in a crowded market. By the end of the chapter, you will have a clear idea of the topic and format for your podcast and will be ready to move on to the planning and preparation stage. How do you identify your target audience? The first step in identifying a target audience is defining the purpose and the content of your podcast. The central theme or topic of your podcast serves as a beacon, attracting listeners interested in that particular subject matter. You listen to this show because you're interested in education and technology. Now, for instance, a podcast focusing on entrepreneurship would naturally draw in business owners, aspiring entrepreneurs, and business students. Therefore, a clear understanding of your podcast purpose and the content is the foundation for identifying your potential listeners. Next, demographic factors such as age, gender, location, occupation, and educational level could also be considered. These demographic details can provide a broad overview of your potential audience. For example, a podcast discussing college life would likely resonate with students, while a podcast centered on, educational technology and how to better integrate technology into your classroom or school, that would appeal to teachers. Or maybe you want a podcast on retirement planning, and that's going to appeal to older adults, not the kids. Beyond demographics, psychographics, which encompass attitudes, interests, and behaviors, offer deeper insights into your ideal listener. Evaluating hobbies, preferred media, and personal values can help shape a more nuanced understanding of your audience. For example, a podcast focusing on sustainable living might attract individuals who prioritize environmental conservation and are interested in eco-friendly practices. Analyzing other podcasts in the same area is another effective strategy for audience identification. By examining other podcasts within your niche, you can gain insights into their listener base. Reviews and social media comments can provide valuable information about what these listeners are interested in and what they value in a podcast. Based on the information that you gather, creating listener personas or fictional profiles like an avatar can be very beneficial. These avatars can help visualize the audience and help you consider their needs and their interests more concretely. Finally, the process of identifying your target audience is not a one-time event, but it's an ongoing process. Once your podcast is launched, data about the actual audience can be collected through podcast hosting platforms or listener surveys. This information can be used to adjust the content and the marketing strategy as needed, ensuring that your podcast continues to resonate with its audience. By understanding your podcast's purpose, considering demographic and psychographic factors, analyzing the competition, creating listener personas, and continuously adjusting based on audience feedback, you as a podcast creator can ensure that your content reaches and engages the right listeners. Finding your niche. Once you have identified your target audience, you can select a very niche topic that will appeal to them. This may require some research and brainstorming to come up with ideas that are specific, relevant, and interesting to your audience. You can also consider the current trends and interests within your audience's demographic. You can look for gaps in the market, and your podcast could fill them. When selecting a niche topic, it's important to balance specificity with broad appeal so that your topic is interesting and unique, but also accessible and relevant to your audience. It's also important to choose a topic that you are passionate about, that you are knowledgeable about, as this will make your podcast more engaging and more authentic to you as well. That's what I do here with the House of EdTech podcast. I have to choose topics and things to talk about that interest me. I also consider things that interest you. Now, what types of podcasts are there? The beautiful thing about podcasting is that it is very, very diverse, and that's an understatement. Podcasts cater to a wide array of interests and preferences. Let me give you an overview of the different types of podcasts that exist. One of the popular types of podcasts is the interview podcast. These podcasts typically feature a host who interviews different guests in each episode. The guests could range from celebrities and industry experts to ordinary people with extraordinary stories. For example, Mark Maron's WTF with Mark Maron podcast and Terry Gross's Fresh Air are great examples of this interview format. News and politics podcasts have also gained a lot of traction. They provide listeners with in-depth analysis and commentary on current events and political issues. These podcasts, such as The Daily from the New York Times, offer an alternative to traditional news outlets, often providing more comprehensive coverage and diverse perspectives. True crime podcasts have seen a huge surge in popularity in recent years. These podcasts dive into real-life crime stories, often involving murder and other serious crimes. Serial was a podcast that investigated a murder case over an entire season. It was a notable example that has captivated millions of listeners worldwide. Education podcasts are another popular genre. These podcasts aim to inform and educate their listeners on a wide range of topics, from history and science to language learning and personal development. Podcasts like Stuff You Should Know and TED Talks Daily fall into this category, just like House of Ed Tech and Podcast PD and all the podcasts on the Education Podcast Network. By the way, you should check out some of the shows on the Education Podcast Network. Go check them out at edupodcastnetwork.com. Storytelling podcasts. Whether you're talking about fiction or nonfiction, these are like audiobooks or radio dramas. They weave compelling narratives that keep listeners hooked. The Moth is a podcast featuring real stories told live on stage. And Welcome to Night Vale is a fictional series set in a strange desert town, and these are great examples of storytelling podcasts. Health and wellness podcasts offer advice and information on various aspects of health, from mental health and mindfulness to fitness and nutrition. The Happiness Lab and Sleepy are great examples of podcasts in this genre. Finally, comedy podcasts aim to entertain and amuse, and oftentimes they feature stand-up comedians, having humorous discussions, or just simple comedic storytelling. Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend is a very popular comedy podcast. Podcasting is incredibly diverse. Podcasts offer content to suit every interest, taste, and mood. Whether you're looking for in-depth knowledge, captivating stories, insightful interviews, or a good laugh, there's a podcast out there for you to listen to. And you can create a podcast as well that fits into any of these categories, or maybe in a new category. The variety of podcast genres reflects podcasting's adaptability and its capacity to cater to the unique preferences of a potential global audience. Here are some tips for selecting your format, because choosing the right format for your podcast is a critical decision that can significantly influence your podcast's success. The format not only shapes the structure and the flow of your podcast, but also sets the tone for your interaction with your audience. Here are some key considerations to guide you in selecting the most suitable podcast format. Align with your content. Your podcast format should align with your content and purpose. If you're sharing expert knowledge on a specific topic, a solo podcast might be suitable. If you're exploring diverse perspectives and various issues, an interview or a panel discussion format might be more appropriate. Consider your strengths. Reflect on your strengths as a host. If you're a great storyteller, a narrative format could showcase your skills. If you excel at engaging in conversations, the interview or co-hosted format might be a good fit. Audience expectations. Think about what your target audience would prefer. A younger audience might appreciate a more casual, conversational style, while a professional audience might prefer a more structured and informative format. Resource availability. Some formats require more resources than others. Interviews require finding and scheduling guests. Narrative podcasts often require significant scripting and editing. Ensure that you have the time, the resources, and the skills to produce your chosen format consistently. Experiment and evolve. Don't be afraid to experiment with different formats in your episodes. You can evolve your format based on feedback from your audience and your comfort level as a host. I've done that here on the House of EdTech. Early on, this was a very interview-heavy podcast. And then I moved away from doing a lot of interviews because scheduling became challenging based on my availability to conduct the interviews and have those conversations. And I got more comfortable getting behind this microphone and sharing what I think. And I think that's also important. And it's your podcast. You can do what you want. Remember, it's your podcast. The other thing you need to consider is consistency. Once you've chosen a format, try to be consistent. This can help the listener set their expectations and help you build a loyal audience. I think I've built a loyal audience here on the podcast while also changing my format. But ultimately, whether it's me talking by myself or having a guest or guests, the goal is the same: to help flatten that learning curve and help you, the listener, better integrate and use education technology in whatever your role is in education. Let's get back to the book, though. Choosing a podcast format is a strategic decision that should be guided by your content, strengths, audience, and resources. Remember, there's no one-size-fits-all format. The best format for your podcast is the one that allows you to effectively share your message, engage your audience, and, this is most important, enjoy the process of podcasting. Let's talk about developing your hook and standing out. One piece of advice for developing a unique angle or a hook for your podcast is to focus on that specific niche within your topic area. This will help you stand out in a crowd. This will help provide your audience with content that is highly relevant and content that is specialized. For example, if your podcast is about sports, you might focus on a particular team or a league or a specific aspect of sports culture. Also, you can try to find a unique perspective or approach to your topic that sets your podcast apart. For example, you might interview people who have a unique connection to your topic or use humor or storytelling to make your content more engaging. Finally, you can try to create a format or structure for your podcast that is different from what is commonly seen in the market, such as using a game show format or incorporating interactive elements. By thinking creatively and focusing on what makes your podcast unique, you can help it stand out in a crowded market. Let's wrap up Chapter 2. Choosing a topic or format for your podcast is an important step in creating a successful and engaging audio experience for your audience. By considering your interests, expertise, and target audience, you can identify a topic and format that are well suited to your goals and your audience. There are many different formats and approaches to podcasting: interviews, solo shows, panel discussions, storytelling, and the right format for your podcast will depend on your content and the audience that you want to grow. By carefully considering your topic and format, you can create a podcast that is unique, that is interesting, and is engaging. And that will help you connect with your audience in a meaningful way. Here are the key takeaways. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 2, where we talked about choosing a topic and the importance of the format for your show. Here are the key takeaways from Chapter 2. Number 1, identify your target audience. Number 2, find your niche topic. Number 3, understand the different types of podcasts that can be created. Number 4, select a format for your podcast. It can change, but you should pick one to start with. And number 5, develop a unique hook for your podcast. And the action steps. If you're listening to this and you're in the process of starting your show, here are some things you can do. Or maybe you've decided to podcast, and what do you do next? Here are some action steps. Define the purpose of your podcast. Write it down. Number 2, research and identify your target audience. Who do you want to speak to? Number 3, brainstorm that topic. What is the niche, very specific topic you'd like to talk about? Number 4, explore the different formats and choose one that best fits who you are. Develop a unique angle or the hook for your podcast. What's going to make your podcast about education technology stand out from everybody else who's podcasting about education technology? And actually, let me just kind of interject here a little bit. Your perspective on the world is what will make your podcast unique. You know as well as I do, House of EdTech is not the only EdTech podcast out there, but this is the only one that's got Chris Nesi as the host. Next, create that listener persona and visualize your ideal audience. Who is your avatar? Who are you speaking to? And finally, for an action step, gather feedback and be open to evolving your podcast based on listener insights. Now, don't really pay much attention to the people who are super critical of your podcast, because if they're super critical or they email you and tell you that your podcast is no good, they're probably not listening anymore. So I wouldn't take what they say too seriously. They're gone. You're not going to get them back. Those are the action steps. Those are the takeaways. That was Chapter 2 of I Like to Podcast and You Will Too, a House of EdTech Guide to Podcasting. I'd love to know what you take away from this chapter, whether you've read it, whether you just listened to it. Let's get in touch. Let's connect. Let's talk about this. If you're interested in starting a podcast, or if you want a podcast with your students, this applies to them too. We can talk about that as well. Send me an email, feedback@chrisnesi.com, and I'm happy to get in touch, and we can grow the next great podcast together. Thank you for listening to the House of EdTech. Please subscribe or follow this podcast wherever you're listening to it right now. And make this podcast a part of your anytime, anywhere professional development. Links to things that I talked about, the podcast that I mentioned, I will link to everything in the show notes, and you can find them on my website. For this episode, go to chrisnesi.com/249. And there'll be a link to that where you're listening. It's a swipe or a tap away in your app. I also want to hear from you, whether it's about what I shared here in Chapter 2, or for another episode that you've listened to, or if you've got something else you want to ask me about. I'm going to make more episodes after I do all the chapters of this book, so let's have a conversation. I want to know your feedback. I want your perspective. Let me know. Don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me, feedback@chrisnesi.com, or better yet, go to chrisnesi.com/voicemail. Let me hear your voice. It's a podcast. Let's do it. I'd also like to encourage you to share this podcast and this episode with another educator who would get value from it. Spread the word and help me reach as many educators as possible. Thank you in advance. And lastly, I want to invite you to become an awesome supporter if you're getting value from my content. I am incredibly grateful for the ongoing support from the following people: Leo, Brian, Aaron, Jeff, Peggy, and Matt. Thank you so much for your foresight. Thank you for valuing what I do. I appreciate that you support the podcast. If you are getting value from the House of EdTech and you want to become an awesome supporter, go to chrisnesi.com/awesome. The next episode of the podcast is a milestone in number, episode 250. I guess you could say I'm making the march to 300. Let's do it. In episode 250, we will continue our journey in the book, and we will do Chapter 3, Planning and Preparing Your Podcast. That's going to come your way on October 13th, 2024. Until next time, I want to thank you for learning with me. Let's talk about launching that podcast. And remember, using technology isn't difficult. Podcasting isn't difficult. Just give it a try.